So this is just a little agenda of the presentation for today. I'm going to start by introducing myself. And when I introduce myself, I always like to say my purpose, why am I here at this moment. I think that's important. Then we're going to enter a very short dialogue space, completely safe. You can say whatever you want. We're going to kind of unpack what we've heard about immigration on this campus or in other spaces. And then we're going to unpack the challenge that is with us in this current political time, this current economic time as well. And we're going to go into a little process that I use when it comes to speaking about matters of immigration. And then the fourth one, I'm going to talk about when I introduce myself and then go back to at the end. So my name is Maciel Valladares. I'm a senior in the business school. I'm a business analytics, marketing, and international business major with a peace and justice minor. And I'm also co-president of Amnesty International on campus. And we are one of the only organizations that focuses strictly on matters of migration, refugees, asylum seeking. So I really encourage you guys to join. It's a great organization, and I'm going to talk at the end about some great stuff that we have planned. So why am I here? I'm an international student from Tegucigalpa, which is the capital of Honduras. If you guys don't know Honduras, it's a country in Central America. You have the United States, Mexico, Guatemala, and then you have Honduras. And it's one of the countries that sends the most migrants to the US. The economic situation there is really bad. There's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of violence, but there's also a lot of beauty, which doesn't get talked about. And I'm here because, first, a privilege check. I'm here on a student visa. I can be here, I can go back to my country legally and know that I'll be safe where I live. And that's a big privilege check for me. So I was here freshman year wondering what I could do about it. Being in the business school too is kind of an eye-opener because the questions of ethics and morality are just chapters at the end of the textbooks, and they're always optional. So I was like, I have to do something about this, and that's why I'm here, just trying to spread the word, I guess, a little more, and trying to make us all think about what our role, if we're immigrants, if we know an immigrant, if our family has been in the United States for generations, what our role is in this whole debate. So to kind of start with a dialogue space, I wanted to ask you guys if you have heard anything about immigration on campus. Maybe that's overhearing something, or maybe that's talking to someone. What are some of the things that you've heard about immigration?
I think when I was maybe a sophomore, the Peace and Justice office put up a sign essentially saying like, immigrants welcome. Yeah. And unfortunately I heard a lot of like very negative things. The sign actually ended up getting taken down, which was something that really upset me, and I didn't understand why the people weren't okay with it.
To go along with that story, my sophomore year, which was actually when we founded Amnesty International, at the activities fair, we got a comment about that specific banner from a kid who shall remain unnamed, but he is in the business school. And he told us if we were the ones behind that banner, we said no, but we completely support it, and he said because I hate it, and kind of looked at us confrontationally to see what we would say about it. And in that moment, I realized that you have to be strategic about how you talk with people, because when they say stuff like that, they're expecting a certain answer, and that only cements their beliefs further. So that's also part of the purpose of why I'm here.
How did you answer it?
I asked him why. I just listened, and it was really hard for me at that point because it was a very personal attack. And I had someone beside me, and I kind of had to like grab his hand and be like, don't say anything, because it's so easy to just start like spewing random stuff. Well, not random stuff, facts. But as we're gonna see later on, facts don't have a lot of power if we don't know how to communicate them, which is another thing that I've learned while being here. Does anyone else have anything? Or perhaps a moment where you wish you would have said something that you overheard and you didn't say anything because you were afraid of the reaction.
Well, I just want to comment on this is that I'm also an international student, and every time I tell somebody that I'm an international student from Mexico, they always ask me, oh, are you here legally? And that's like the go-to question. It's like, yes, but why is this your
concern?
Response? And that's like the first thing.
Yeah. Well, that happens a lot. Anyone else? How many of you here are freshmen? Okay, maybe that's why. But And I don't want to paint a very negative picture of this campus. There's incredible people, and the Center for Peace and Justice is amazing. I encourage y'all guys to go there. But you do hear a lot of stuff here, especially when people don't know you're there, or when you're white passing, or when you're white, people feel more comfortable saying those types of things as well. So keep an ear out, and hopefully this will help you guys if you ever come across that situation to know how to respond, and more so to know why you should respond at all. So starting off, just gonna paint a picture of what the situation is right now. In the last 10 years, anti-immigrant fervor has become increasingly mainstreamed. And there are groups that were once considered very, very, very far to the right that are now considered part of the mainstream conversation, which is really scary. We have Act for America. The logo looks really pretty. It looks like it's all patriotic. This is actually an anti-Muslim group that has recently adopted immigration into their agenda because they equate immigration with terrorism. This right here, that's the President of the United States. Behind him, you can see the Remembrance Project. The Remembrance Project was actually founded by a Hispanic woman who had papers, was a US citizen, and as you can see there, it says, honoring and remembering Americans killed by illegal aliens. And we have to pay attention to that rhetoric. This woman actually made a quilt that is part of what that event was, and that quilt had the faces of the people who were killed by illegal aliens. Now, I'm not here to say that those people aren't important. I'm not here to say that that's not a problem. A life is a life. But to have a whole group focused on very, very, very small numbers of people, and to have the President of the United States be in an event condoning that is very alarming. What's more alarming is that this group supports a group called the American Border Patrol, which call themselves a nonprofit, but they're actually armed vigilantes that have a lot of technology at the border and are always screening who's passing the border, and they have killed people. And no one does anything about it. Now, I think that's illegal, more so than being an illegal alien, which shouldn't even be a term in the first place. So think about 10 years before, would you ever have seen the President of the United States in an event with a group who condones killing people on US soil or in general? This would have never happened. Espinosa is the founder of this group, and as you can see in that quote, she's a rising star in a constellation of activists belonging to the once marginalized anti-immigration right. And I think that condenses the overall environment in which we find ourselves in right now. So you see this, and well, I see this, and I'm like, shit, like, what do we do about this? This is a really big problem. It's very overwhelming. So over the years, as I told you guys, I'm a senior, I've kind of come up with a little mental process that has steps that makes me feel more comfortable when I'm approaching this type of rhetoric. Because also of my position as co-president of Amnesty, I am put in those situations where I am expected to speak for immigrants. So I've had to learn this, and I hope that you guys can kind of get some of that as well. So this is my question, my main problem. The facts are out there, as we will see later on, but how do we communicate, and should we communicate them at all? This is the process. First, we need the tools. When we think about the tools, we think of content. We think of the data. We think of what we have to know about immigration, not only because it's true, but to feel comfortable with ourselves that we are in a position to advocate for immigrants. Because if we are we like all immigrants, I will adopt a pro-immigrant stance because I'm a Democrat, that's not enough. You have to know the substance. You have to know what you're talking about for other people to believe you. The method goes to the whole issue of communication. How are you going to communicate this? Sadly, the facts don't speak for themselves, because when it comes to topics that are very controversial, the truth becomes politicized. And what's politicized isn't considered the truth. And that's a very sad reality in which we have to operate strategically under. And lastly, and I think most importantly, is the need. Because you can have the tools, you can have great communication skills, you can train yourself to have a poker face in every situation, but if you inside don't feel like you should be talking about this, then it's not going to come across as genuine. If you think that you talking won't have an impact, then it's not going to come across as authentic. And people, I've realized, are very good at perceiving authenticity. So to start with the tools, as you can see, I like to break things down. I'm a very structured thinker. We need three things. We often focus on the data because that's what's most readily available. But we also have to consider the history and the stories of the people. So let's start with the data. This is one of the things that we hear the most. Immigrants take American jobs and are criminals. We've heard this, well, I've heard this at least, everywhere, coming from the most well-intentioned people to people who I think suck, but everyone says it. The fact is that that's just simply not true. The economics say that, and this is only one group of immigrants, by the way, but we're going to talk about undocumented immigrants because this is the context in which these things are said. Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for most of things that you would consider Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps. They can't get that. Yet they often start their own businesses. They often have properties, which means that they have to pay taxes. So there have been many studies conducted that show that undocumented immigrants give more than they take. This means that this isn't true. And there's also no correlation in states where there is a larger immigrant population to a larger unemployment rate of Americans. So we can see that that's simply not true. The second question is that of security. And we've seen again the President of the United States saying that this is a big problem. And this is very tied with a lot of people's concerns about why immigrants are here. One of the biggest gangs in Central America is MS-13, La Mara Salvatrucha, actually originated in Los Angeles. They were deported back to El Salvador and Honduras. They didn't even originate in Central America, which is something that is not talked about at all. And there are a very small number of people as well, but for some reason everyone likes to talk about them, give them a platform unnecessarily, and generalize and say that those are all immigrants. Second, terrorism. The question of terrorism and equating any immigrant to someone that does not love the country if they're not assimilating is also very big. We tend to think of a lack of assimilation as a hate for this country, and then therefore a hate for this country equals terrorism. And that's what's said about all immigrants as well. Now, more importantly also, we have to know the history. Immigration has never been an issue. It's racism that has been the issue at the core of immigration. Since 1790, which was when the first immigration law was passed, it literally said it's only for free white persons. After that, and I can send you so many links, you can see the entire history of the United States when it comes to immigration has been tarnished with racism. There was the Yellow Peril, which was when all the Chinese immigrants were deported because they thought that, well, Americans thought they were getting their jobs. They were just deported, and these were people that were actually citizens. Coming a little more to the 20th century, in 1913, the President Hoover, I think, deported 1 million Mexican immigrants, half of which were actually US citizens, just because of a Mexican scare problem again. And you can go throughout history and see how people have been deported, not because they are immigrants, but because they are not white. So we need to bring this to people's attentions, especially when we hear these types of statements. I don't have anything against immigrants. My grandparents were Irish, but, and then a whole spew of hate follows that. And people think that by saying that their grandparents were Irish, and that's very important, I'm not going to say that it's not important, and I'm not going to trivialize anyone's generational history, but that doesn't give you a platform to talk negatively about immigration because Irish people are white. And the rhetoric. The rhetoric is so important here. You hear things like skilled versus unskilled immigrants, and somehow that's used as a way to qualify immigrants. We want skilled immigrants, but we don't want unskilled immigrants. Yet we are all human people. And all human people should not have something that qualifies them based on the skills. And what is missed in this debate is that unskilled immigrants are usually unskilled because they've been through poverty that was usually caused by US imperialism in those countries. And we never talk about that. And finally, my least favorite word, legal versus illegal. There is no such thing. We are all human beings. No one was born illegally. frankly, I just think this should not be in the rhetoric at all, but it's there. We have to deal with it. We have to be careful ourselves when we say illegal immigration. It's very easy. I say it sometimes too, and I'm here talking about this because this is what we hear everywhere. I started calling it just immigration. So you can do that as well. And then finally, the stories. We have this concept of immigrants as a homogeneous group of people. And that erases everyone's stories. Because when you start thinking of immigrants as this big group of people, they just become statistics, they just become a concept, they just become political discourse that's very detached from the realities of these. I encourage you all to go and talk to someone who you know is an immigrant. If you're an immigrant yourself, talk to people from other countries on the other side of the world who have their own immigration stories, because I do genuinely believe that inherently people are empathetic, and when they hear stories, that's very powerful. So let's just be sure to not homogenize all immigrants. Right now we're hearing mostly about Latinx immigrants. There's many other immigrants that are coming as well. There's immigration in Europe as well. Eastern Europeans, for example, are facing a lot of discrimination in Western Europe. Africans going towards Europe, there's just blatant racism against them. This isn't just a problem. Well, it's not a problem at all. This isn't just a circumstance of the United States. This is everywhere, and we have to make sure that we acknowledge that. And finally, the causes. Another thing that's missing in the discourse of immigration is why they're coming here. And I'm going to be careful saying this because I don't think that we should have a hierarchy of problems. Everyone has their own problem, and their problems are relative based on what you've experienced in your life. However, many people who talk about immigration in the United States are not aware of what it means to live in a country like Honduras, of what it means to live in a country like Ghana. They're just not aware of that. And I'm not blaming people for that because I, coming from Honduras, have seen that with my own eyes. So I don't expect everyone to be aware of that. But we have to make sure that we don't say that it's okay just because they haven't experienced it. Google exists. There's movies. There's just so many ways to know what's going on in the world that I haven't experienced it is frankly not an excuse for anything. So the data, the history, the stories, these are your tools. You have to do a little research, know the data. What's positive is that we know that all the data actually, well, most of the data is in favor of immigrants, and now we just have to know how to communicate this. So this goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning. Tools are useless without knowing how to use them. So the facts do not speak for themselves in this situation. What do we do? This is what I call the method, and it's broken down into two parts. The first part is understanding the context in which we are in right now. I talked a little bit about this in the beginning, but now we're going to delve a little more into how polarized, because the society is so polarized, it's very difficult to have conversations with people who don't agree with you. And I think we've all probably had that experience where people are just talking and you never get to an agreement because you just want to tell your truth, the other person wants to tell their truth, and that's not constructive. So the overtone window is actually a term in political science for the type of political rhetoric and political policy that is accepted in the norm. Over the years, both in the left and in the right, these norms have shifted towards the extreme. So we have things, for example, like abolish ICE, which back in the day used to be a very, very extremist point of view. Now, I think we should abolish ICE. I'm not saying that it's not true, but now this is part of the norm. We have zero tolerance policies, which are behind family separation, and people have no problem saying that they support this. So we see now how the overtone window is getting farther and farther and farther away, and I think this statistic demonstrates this disparity. If you are a numbers person, that's why I put this here. But in a survey, they asked people if they thought that immigration was a critical threat to the U.S.'s vital interest, and 19% of Democrats said yes, 78% of Republicans, 19% of Democrats said no, and 78% of Republicans said yes. That's a very, very big difference. So that's the macro perspective. And before I delve, that was supposed to say micro. And before I delve into the micro perspective, I want to show you guys a little video. It's an animation that shows how in the House of Republicans there's been less and less and less agreement throughout the years, and I think this is a really neat graphic that exemplifies this disparity. Because we don't have to see each year, but you can see now how there are some connections. Now we're going to fast forward to the 21st century, and we see how it kind of looks like mitosis. They're all splitting apart, and there's really very, very few connections there. Let's talk a little bit about this, because at first I saw it in a class that I took that's called Mathematics of Fairness. Really cool class. It takes a mathematical approach to questions of how should things be split, gerrymandering, a lot of stuff. Really cool class. But my professor showed me this, and I was just shook by how something can be so real that you can just see it with your eyes. Like you can, I don't know. I think this is really cool, but also really sad, and I wanted to show you guys, because I think it exemplifies how difficult it is to talk to someone, especially when the House of Representatives can't agree on anything. And it's even more alarming when it comes to questions that involve human lives, like immigration. It just shouldn't be a political topic. So that's the macro part. Understanding that is very important. Do you guys mind this? No? I'm just gonna go. Okay. So for the micro part, we hear many conversations around immigration in different settings, and we have to be aware of the setting in which we find ourselves in, because that's going to require a different approach. A little story. I told you guys I was in VSB. For me, speaking up in VSB has become sort of like a moral imperative, because I know that no one else is going to do it. And that's scary. Like, I feel myself getting scared. I know that my voice is going to shake, and that sometimes makes me think that I shouldn't talk at all, because it's just going to create a tension in the classroom. But then I realized, that doesn't matter. Even if I talk with fear, I'm still talking, and I don't know how other people are going to receive that. Someone might think, that's an interesting point. When it comes to the classroom, I tend to give more statistics, the data part of what we were talking about, because then if you have a professor, for example, who you know very clearly doesn't agree with what you're going to say, because of their stance as a professor, it's very hard for them to say, well, that's not true. So classroom setting, different approach. When you're overhearing conversations, and this is the setting in which I hear things about immigration most often, it's even scarier to be the one who steps in, because first, you're admitting that you're overhearing. Second, if you're a person of color, there's a stereotype of the angry person of color, especially when you're a woman, and you don't want to give content to that stereotype. But I think the same holds true here. If you don't say anything, chances are no one else is going to say anything. But the approach is different. Not going to start spewing statistics to people. We're just having a conversation like a machine. You can take a different approach and say, hey, relate it to yourself. That's not cool that you're talking about this like this. People don't realize that immigration is right in front of them, especially in a campus like Villanova, because we think that everyone here is the same. And everyone here is pretty similar, but we have to make our voices heard. No one's going to do it for us, unfortunately. And finally, when we're with friends and family, it can get a little passionate. Again, a little story, being from Honduras. Honduras is a very conservative society. Even in that country, people who are in the upper middle classes blame immigrants, saying that they just want to escape their circumstances, and that breaks my heart hearing that, because we see the situations of people who are in extreme poverty every day, yet we think it's their fault just because we know of one exception. Because we know that one person who through education got somewhere, and we think that that means that everyone can do that. But there's other factors that we don't see. There's people going through so many things in their homes, in their schools, on the streets. We only see one facet of the story. So anyway, when I'm at home and I tend to have conversations about feminism, for example, which is oh my God, she's a feminist in my house, I need to be a little more strategic about it, and it sucks that you have to be strategic with your family and friends because you're not used to that, but that's simply the reality of it. At first, I started being all inflamed, finding myself in a zone of comfort because I was with my friends and family. I thought that they would be receptive to anything I said, no matter how I said it. And sadly, I learned that that wasn't true. Of course, this is personal. You know your own friends, you know your own family. But I learned that for my family, at least, I had to calm down, breathe, and then talk. That doesn't mean I'm hiding my anger, and we're going to talk about that later on, because anger is important, and it's something that we must talk about as well. But it only means that now I know what the best way to approach them is. And I'm really glad because my little brother, who's actually 16, has told me that if it weren't for those conversations that we had at the dinner table, he wouldn't have found the courage to talk about this in school. He goes to the same school that I went to, and my school is an evangelical missionary school is the best way to describe it, and it's just a very conservative space. And to know that my little brother feels like he can go out there and say these things because of what I did in my house is really empowering, and I think everyone should think about those situations. You have power. You can influence at least one person in your life. So this is part one of understanding the method, understanding your context. The second, as I was talking about, is acknowledging your anger. This woman is an icon. Her name is Audre Lorde. She coined the way for intersectional feminism back in the 1960s, and she wrote this keynote address. She delivered this keynote address in which she talked about anger. And going back to the trope of black angry women, she was a black lesbian feminist in the 1960s, writing academic discourse and saying we should all use our anger. That's courageous. So this is why I admire her a lot, and you're gonna see a lot of quotes from her because she's just amazing.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
So I think, I'm just gonna read this because I think it's the best way to put it. I'm not gonna try to critique Audre Lorde or condense her words. Her words speak for themselves. So she says, "I cannot hide my anger to spare you guilt, nor hurt feelings, nor answering anger, for to do so insults and trivializes all our efforts. Guilt is not a response to anger. It is a response to one's own actions or lack of action. If it leads to change, then it can be useful, since it becomes no longer guilt but the beginning of knowledge. Yet all too often, guilt is just another name for impotence, for defensiveness, destructive of communication. Becomes a device to protect ignorance and the continuation of things the way they are, the ultimate protection for changelessness." We can't be afraid to be angry because we're going to hurt someone's feelings. Anger is not the same as hatred. Anger has a goal in mind. Hatred is for the sake of hatred. So, we know the tools now, we know how to use them. Now we go to this question of, why do I need to use them? Can I actually have some sort of impact? And this is a question I grapple with a lot because I'm a very pragmatic person and I like to see the fruits of what I'm doing. And very often in the activism space, you don't see the fruits of what you're doing immediately, so it can get discouraging. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact. Like I told you guys, it had an impact on my little brother. I didn't know that after 2 years. But I didn't stop, even though it would have been very easy to stop, especially on a campus. And this presentation is in the context of this campus that tends to disregard the voices of activists, and no policy is changed, and that can be really discouraging. However, The first reason why we must address this is because of intersectionality. As I told you guys before, immigration has never been a problem, it's been racism, and it's always about the othering of the person of color, not because you were born in some other country. Those are just borders made by men. So I have this quote that exemplifies the relations between race, colonialism. I added this because it's all related, but I really like this quote because when we're talking about immigration, we must talk about imperialism and colonialism. So migrants do not arrive in an empty or neutral space, but in metropolitan spaces that are already polluted by racial power relations with a long colonial history, colonial imaginary, colonial knowledge, and racial and ethnic hierarchies linking to a history of empire, the US. In other words, migrants arrive in a space of power relations that is already informed and constituted by coloniality. So I've always found it very ironic that in the US, Americans are afraid of accepting the very people that they threw out of their own country. And that's at the core of the question of intersectionality. And we add things like gender, climate change, sexuality, and we see how this is all interconnected. And that for me is sad but equally hopeful because it means that if you concentrate your efforts in one thing, you're also going to be impacting other things without you directly having to worry about this. This happens to me a lot too. I wake up and I think, there's so much going on in the world. How can I possibly tackle everything? And the reality is you can't, I can't. So by focusing on one thing and not leaving it behind, you're already going to be addressing other issues, even if you don't know it. Climate change is very important when it comes to immigration. The way things currently are, there's going to be millions and millions of more displaced peoples just because of climate change. And that's something that we have to talk about as well, because we tend to think that immigration is a policy thing, that it's an economic thing, but the same colonialist powers that killed people of color are the same colonialist powers that created this economic system of exploitation and getting the resources of the world. Now the question of impact. I have learned that silence always helps the oppressor, and we hear that a lot, and I heard that a lot, yet there were circumstances where I thought that me speaking up was more destructive than constructive because I was just playing into the opponent's narrative. That's what I thought. But it's worse to not give someone the opportunity to listen to what you have to say than to say something and then they can maybe take it the wrong way, but it's out there. You did your part. That's better than silence. So there will always be some sort of impact, whether it be minuscule, whether it be big, there's always going to be something there. And you have to understand your role. I am not a black woman. I stand in solidarity with black women, but I'm not going to be at the forefront of black women's issues. This isn't a thing about fame. This isn't a thing about you're going to be the activist in your school. This is a thing about you're going to work for what you truly believe in because you understand your role in that greater equation. And we all have a role. White men have a role. Everyone literally has a role in this. So understanding that with a humble perspective is really important as well. Another Audre Lorde quote. When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed, but when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak. I think it's always good to say something about what you believe in. It's scary, but once you start doing it, you feel more comfortable. Once you know the data, the history, the stories, you become more comfortable. Once you know the settings in which you're operating, you become more comfortable and you feel better about saying these things. But it's hard to start. And then lastly, self-love. I don't want you to think about self-love as face masks. That's not what I'm talking about right now. A feminist called Bell Hooks, like Audre Lorde, said that self-love is political, and it's radically political, especially for people who are not expected to love themselves, like women of color. Loving yourself when the world has told you that you can't love yourself is a political act. And everyone should understand that, because another big thing in the activism space is burnout. And we all need to understand that self-love comes first, but it's also not disconnected from the greater fight because of this concept right here, interconnectedness. There's also a concept in Buddhism called interbeing. It means that my existence is tied with yours. And I really, really love that framing of the world because self-love is loving other people. For me, if I am not doing anything for another person, I am not loving myself. And that has been a very powerful for me. That has been a very powerful way for me to think about these things, especially when I become discouraged. The other day, I had the opportunity to go to the University of Pennsylvania for their MLK talk, and Angela Davis was there along with Gina Dent. And someone asked Gina Dent, they're very famous feminists, by the way, what do you do when you're feeling burned out? What do you do for self-love? Like expecting them to say like, oh, well, I watch Netflix and I watch this. But Gina Dent said something so beautiful. She said she basically said what I'm trying to say, but in a more beautiful way. So I'm just giving her credit for that concept. But she brought up the whole notion of interbeing and how throughout her entire career, and she's like 50, 60 years old, civil rights activist, feminist, she's always thought of self-love as tied to other people. And another Audre Lorde quote, of course. I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. And we can apply this to anyone and everyone. And I think this is at the core of self-love. So finally, to summarize, the first thing we need are the tools in the form of the data, the history, and the stories. We need to humanize immigrants because the media isn't going to do that for us. The media is just going to use the word immigrants and expect everyone to think of their own thing. So we need to be the ones who are there advocating for immigrants. If you are an immigrant and it's hard for you to share your story, there's other ways that you can help. You don't have to feel pressured to always be at the forefront of this. You do what's best for yourself while helping others. The method, understanding the context. The reality is we're operating under a very hard context, and it's really hard to get to an agreement with someone. But even just saying that out loud, when you're talking to, for example, I don't know, a Trump supporter, and you say like, listen, like I acknowledge that we inherently have different views on this, but can we get somewhere today? Acknowledging that right before you start talking can be really powerful, because if not, then it doesn't get anywhere. And then finally, acknowledging your anger. I don't know who went here to the talk yesterday, Valerie Kerr. She gave this really, really powerful graphic about what it means to love when it comes to activism. And she did talk about self-love. And she said, I always acknowledge my anger, and I do that, for example, she gave the example of her being with her kid. She has a little boy, and she said, sometimes I'm really angry at my kid, but like I'm not gonna suppress my anger because that's just gonna come out later in some other way. So I go to a room and like I rant to a friend or something, but I acknowledge it, I put it out there, and then I listen to my kid. So it's important for us to find ways to acknowledge our anger. We might all have different ways of doing that. I rant to Camille, who is my roommate. I write a lot too, but don't suppress your anger. And if you have to be angry in front of a group of people, be angry in front of a group of people. You probably have the right to do so, and that's not a bad thing. And finally, the need. We need to acknowledge that we're all in a fight together, that we all have a certain role in this bigger fight. Whether you want to dedicate your life to activism or not, there's always something you can do for the other. The impact is always going to be there if you're not silent. And finally, you do all of this because you love yourself. And in loving yourself, you're loving others. So that's my little process. Again, this isn't academic or anything. This is just throughout my 4 years here, what I've been thinking about. And I wanted to end this by giving really exciting news. Villanova is actually going to have their first immigration week, which is a week dedicated solely to immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, anything related to immigration. February 17th to the 21st, there's going to be a panel where we're going to hear from people from Villanova who are related to immigration in one way or another. We're going to have a faculty member, a staff member, and a student speak about their experiences as immigrants at Villanova. There's going to be food. And we're going to have a lot of other campaigns, the myths and realities around immigration. And we're just very excited to share that because Villanova has never had that many days dedicated to speaking about this. So I encourage you all guys to come to the panel, to tell your friends about this, to follow amnesty.nolasgen on Instagram, join our mailing list, and reach out if you ever want to talk about anything. I'm always available, and everyone in Amnesty is always available as well. So thank you. That was it. And thank you for coming. And if you have questions, we have 20 minutes, or if not, you can go do your thing. But if anyone has questions.
So I know because I'm the person that gets vented to, but what was essentially the process of getting Immigration Week to be a thing?
Yeah. So starting by the creation of Amnesty, which was in my sophomore year, so 2 years ago, making sure that we had enough people, and that was mainly through the activities fair. But for Immigration Week itself, once we had our club established, we actually went and talked to the vice provost, the office of the provost, because we knew that for this to be a thing, it couldn't just be Amnesty saying this is going to be Immigration Week and that's it. There's other initiatives on campus that get support from many departments. I'm not going to name which ones, and that's great, and that's what we were going for. So the first thing was talking to the vice provost. After that, there's a very large network actually at Villanova of faculty members that care about immigration. I also work at the law school, and my boss is an immigration lawyer, so she gave me a lot of contact information. But basically talking to a lot of people, getting money from different places, talking to campus ministry, they really helped a lot with that, and everything through the Center for Peace and Justice. So if you guys have a cause that you're really passionate about and you don't see anything at Villanova, there's many ways for you to create something. It's gonna be overwhelming, I'm not gonna lie, but there's ways.